Actually, I will just for the formality of it all, we'll go back to, yep, okay. Oh, right. I'm just going to replace the share with my image here so that it looks nice and formal. Okay, everyone. Hello and welcome to the final seminar in the first half of 2025 for the International Seminar Series at Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai. I am the convener and host of this seminar series, Associate Professor MRX Dentith, a member of the Center for International Philosophy here at Beijing Normal at Zhuhai. It is my great pleasure to present this time round the work of Neri Marsili. Neri is a researcher, or is actually a researcher who's just about to end his tenure at UNID in Madrid and about to start his next job in Turin. His job in Madrid has been leading the interdisciplinary project IDANOC. Do you call that IDANOC, or do you just always go by the letters there?
I use Ethernet, but
All right, IDANOC.
either is fine.
Idanok it is, because I always go, oh, actually, it could be Idanok, Idanok, Idanok. Great. He's a member of Metis, Logos, BAP, and the original Cogito Research Group. I actually met Neri in Macau last year, where he gave an absolutely fascinating talk. So I've got high standards for his talk this time. His primary research concerns sincere and insincere communication and communicative norms. And more generally, he's interested in a philosophy of language, especially pragmatics and speech act theory, social epistemology, so the idea of testimony, online communication, and the like, aesthetics, particularly the philosophy of literature, ethics with respect to norms, and experimental philosophy. And he's currently putting together a book manuscript on sincerity and insincerity. How goes that book manuscript?
Oh, I'm waiting for reviewers' comments, which should have been
Ah,
in a while ago.
oh, that's
So
always, to my
I
mind,
did finish it.
actually the worst part. The writing is bad. Waiting for the review somehow feels worse. Anyway, this time round, he's giving us a talk which is rethinking assertion in the age of AI. And I'm now going to hand over to Neri to give the presentation. So let me stop my share,
Okay.
and you can start yours.
Oh, I'm not sharing.
No,
I
because
thought I was.
I
Okay.
replace your share with mine.
I see. I see. Let's go. Uh, all right. This should be it. Okay. I can't see any of you, so please, if there is any issue, just say something because I will hear. So the talk today is about, I guess, two topics at once. On the one hand, we're gonna talk about AI and their capabilities, and on the other hand, we're gonna review some theories of what assertion is and what it means for a certain agent to communicate. And the overall goal is to try to establish if AI can communicate and in what sense. This is a question that has interested philosophers and computer scientists alike since, in particular, LLM came out. And there are different ways we can decide to approach this question. So let's say we're interested in determining to which extent can LLMs be said to communicate? Can they really communicate like humans, or maybe they do something different that just come close to it, or maybe they're doing something completely remote from what we do when we communicate. So as you can see on the slide, we might interpret this question in different ways. One is to just simply wonder whether or not the words that are used by these entities are able to refer, or they have the meaning in the same way that a normal utterance has a meaning. We might wonder whether they are a genuine assertion in the sense that they can present a content as true, that they can advance a claim. And we can wonder whether they can perform speech acts in the fullest sense. And this, obviously, the first question, the second question, and the third question are related in the sense that an assertion is a kind of speech acts, but not all speech acts are assertions. So when we use the word speech act, we are referring to different kinds of expression, like let's say commands, promises, etc. Now, obviously, to the extent that LLMs are not human agents and cannot perform some actions, they can't really be said to perform some speech acts just because of some limitations of this technology. So, for instance, they can only interact with us by text, etc. And also, there are social conventions that prevent them from achieving the ability to perform some speech acts, such as marrying someone. We simply don't have conventions such that an AI would be able to perform a marriage. So it doesn't really make all that much sense to ask the third question, insofar also as it would demand that we go into the details about which speech acts can be performed and which cannot be performed. And this would take us a little bit on a side quest. So to keep discussion more focused on what really interested us, which is whether they can communicate, it does make sense to focus on the speech act of assertion, also because it's considered by many philosophers and linguists to be rightly or maybe wrongly the central speech act, so to say, the most fundamental one, because it's the one by which we communicate that something is the case. So there has been, as you have seen in the previous slide, a lot of work on assertion and on AI and assertion, on whether AI can communicate. But I'm a little dissatisfied, let's say, with previous work. And the reason for that is that this previous work tends to apply fairly simplistic method, which is to pick a certain account of assertion and then see if this account of assertion applies to AI. So for instance, you might say, well, to assert is just to take responsibility for something being the case, and then you test whether or not a machine can take responsibility for what they communicate, for what they say, and you have a response to your question. What's the problem with this approach? The problem with this approach, first of all, is that there is a substantial disagreement about how assertion is to be defined. And so since there is disagreement, the problem is that different authors will have different views. So using a certain account of assertion and testing whether AI can satisfy the conditions that are set by that account of assertion has the risk of simply like reflecting one's theoretical approach. So let's say you have a certain view about assertion, then obviously you might have a positive or a negative answer, but this positive or negative answer as to whether AI can assert will be conditional on your account of assertion being true. So every response to the question given by this methodology will sort of be relative to one's theoretical commitment. So will in a way be just a reflection of your view rather than a substantial explanation of what's going on when LLMs communicate. Also, we use the term assertion, we use the term making claims or affirming in different ways, both in philosophy and also in ordinary language. So for sure, having a pluralist approach in which we explore that maybe the different ways instead of a single ways in which we might talk about assertion and whether there are some of these ways that are compatible with AI assertion will surely give us a richer picture that really is compatible with these different ways in which the term is used, and would also be less theory laden in the sense of reflecting our theoretical commitments. So before I delve into discussion of the different account of assertions and how they are applied to AI, I want to first introduce the general structure of objections to AI assertion. What do I mean by an objection to AI assertion? I simply mean that a certain argument that is meant to establish the conclusion that AI cannot assert. And usually the structure of this argument that you will find in the literature is that, first of all, we claim that some condition C is required for making assertions, such as, let's say, we might say, oh, it's necessary that you have an intention of a certain kind to make an assertion. Then you add a further premise, you say, well, artificial intelligence lacks the ability of forming intentions because they don't have a real brain, because they're just a stochastic parrot or whatever. You come up with your story as to why this condition cannot be satisfied by AI. And then you draw the conclusion, then therefore AI cannot assert. So this is the kind of standard structure that you will find in the literature. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that because we will go through a lot of these potential objections. So maybe the talk is going to be a little bit repetitive, but it's good to familiarize with the general structure so that then we can explore different variants more quickly. Now, in response to this objection, there are also some replies, which can also be interpreted as arguments in favor of AI assertion. So ways to instead defend the idea that AI can assert. So let's see 3 kinds of replies that we can offer. First of all, we might have a full vindication, a full defense of the idea that AI can assert. And how can we offer a full defense? Well, first of all, we might say that in reality, LLMs AI is capable of satisfying this given condition that we have established is necessary for assertion. So for instance, we can say, oh, as a matter of fact, LLMs can form intentions or can take responsibility for what they, for the content of their statements that they put up in our chat. Or in alternative, we might say, well, actually, this condition that you claimed is necessary for asserting really is not necessary. So we might say, well, actually, asserting doesn't require an intention. So even if AI doesn't form any genuine intention, they can still assert because intention is just irrelevant here. I call it a full vindication because if we manage to establish the truth of one of these claims, which basically is the rejection of one of the 2 premises in the previous argument, so the claim number 1 here or the claim number 2, if we manage to do that, then we have a full defense of AI assertion. But a very common strategy that we find in the literature is instead to find a little bit of a common ground, like sort of mediation between a positive answer and a negative answer. How can we achieve that? Well, first of all, we might argue that artificial intelligence, that these machines have their own version of this condition that is said to be required for assertion. So let's say that our claim was that asserting required a certain intention. Then we might say, well, machines don't really have intentions in the sense that humans do, but they have something like a proto-intention, something that is on the way to becoming something like intention or something that is sufficiently similar to intention. So in this case, what we're claiming is that the LLMs are able to satisfy the condition for asserting up to a certain extent, not quite in the same sense as human, but on their way there. An alternative but similar argument is that there is we could slightly revise what assertion requires. So we might say, look, the notion of assertion, in general, the notion of communication are conceptual repertoire for communicative term is anthropocentric because linguists and philosophers and also ordinary people are simply very much used to talk about humans when they talk about communication, when they talk about assertions, etc. So we have developed a version of this concept that is designed to apply only to humans. But if we were to just slightly revise with this concept, we would still capture a very similar phenomenon, perhaps something that is essentially the same as our ordinary notion of assertion. And the only reason why we don't have this broader concept is that this concept evolved in a sort of anthropocentric mindset of way of thinking. So if we were to revise the concept a little bit, it would cover assertion as well. So this is the quasi-assertion argument. The proto-assertion argument and the quasi-assertion argument are very similar. One says that the condition is almost satisfied. The other says that we could change the condition a little bit and we would still have an assertion. What they have in common also is that depending on how distant the sort of condition that is satisfied by machines is from the condition that is actually required from our current concept of assertion, depending on how wide the gap between these two concepts is, really the claim changes a lot, no? Because if we're talking about quite a big gap, then revising the concept would be a substantial revision, and or for the proto-assertion argument, there is still a lot to evolve for the machine to get there and be the same as human. Whereas instead, if we're talking about a fairly small gap, then the argument really comes close to a full vindication of AI's ability to assert. And in the rest of the discussion, like to spare you some time as well, and also not to become too repetitive, I will not discuss like how wide the gap should be considered to be. I will just mention that it is an option to present an argument of this kind. And also, since the proto-assertion argument and the quasi-assertion argument come very close to each other, I will just discuss them together, so to say, to save some time. So what's the plan for the rest of the talk? Basically, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to present different theories of assertion and then evaluate the availability of replies. So let's assume that someone objects that a certain analysis of assertion could apply to AI. Then we are going to see which kind of replies we could offer in response to AI assertion. And then on the basis of that, we will have a sort of verdict for every theory of assertion out there. For every theory of assertion, we're going to see whether there's a plausible defense of the concept of AI assertion to be offered. And then we're going to have a sort of pluralist picture where we see all the senses in which we could say that AI is capable to assert. Now, when it comes to theories of speech acts, a standard distinction that we have is that we distinguish theories of speech acts in intentionalist and conventionalist. This is the main distinction, which basically says, well, you know, in order to communicate, in order to perform a certain speech act, if you are an intentionalist, you think that it's all about intention. It's all about intending to bring about certain effects. For instance, asserting is about intending to persuade your audience or something like that. Whereas if you're a conventionalist, you are going to think that what is crucial for performing certain speech act is that some conventions are met. So we're going to review some theories that are intentionalist, some that are conventionalist, and then we're also going to review some theories that focus on the effect of a speech act, which basically is the idea that we can identify a certain speech act based on what kind of effects they bring about when they are performed. So this kind of theories can admit an intentionalist or conventionalist interpretation. So I leave them as a sort of third categories. Starting from intentionalist view, perhaps the most influential out there is the Gricean analysis of meaning that then has been reinterpreted as an analysis of speeches by different authors. And when it comes to assertion, the Gricean analysis says something like the following. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's always good to rehearse a little bit. Basically, the idea of Grice is that you are meaning something and you're asserting something when you intend that your interlocutor believes that what you're saying is true, at least partially because they recognize your intention to make them believe the content of your statement. So basically, what is crucial to assertion is an intention to persuade your audience in virtue of them recognizing that you are trying to persuade. Okay, so this is the Gricean analysis of assertion, but also we might think of a sort of weaker version of intentionalism about assertion. And this is just the idea that assertion requires an intention in the weak sense of not being the kind of thing that you can perform unintentionally. So suppose that I try to speak in a language that I'm not familiar with, such as, I don't know, some German. I'm not really good at German. Maybe I try to say a sentence in German. I end up saying something else. Have I made this other assertion? Maybe I wanted to say, oh, I really like this, and I end up saying, I really dislike this. Have I asserted that I disliked the content of my assertion? A weak intentionalist would say no. And the reason why I haven't made an assertion is that I didn't want to communicate that. And in order to make an assertion, I have to have an intention to communicate the content of my assertion. This is a weaker requirement that of the Gricean analysis, because there is no intention to persuade the audience built into this analysis of assertion. It's simply saying, look, for asserting, you at least need to intend to communicate the content of the assertion. So I guess these two views, it's really easy to mount, I think, if not easy, intuitive, what kind of objection we could have. Like, we are all familiar with LLMs. We know they don't have human brains. We presumably also think that they lack internal states, such as intention. So if you think that intentions are required, then machines clearly cannot assert because they lack the ability to form intentions. And then we might also say, well, you know, the Gricean analysis requires some sophisticated mechanism of meta-representation. What does that mean? It means that in order to have a Gricean intention, to intend that to persuade you because you recognize my intention to persuade you, I have to have the ability of representing you as the kind of entity that has some mental states and engage in what is called sometimes mind reading. So the idea that I can infer what you're thinking on the basis of your behavior, etc. So if I lack this ability, presumably I cannot have the intention to modify your mental state as a result of my utterance. So this is the second kind of objection. It kind of runs parallel to the first one, but they both have to do with machines lacking the sort of cognitive abilities that we humans have. So this is a reason to think that they don't really communicate in the sense in which we do. Now, when it comes to this last sort of objection, the idea that machines lack meta-representational abilities, this can be disputed on the basis of some recent studies. Basically, like quite a few researchers lately have been running some tests on some so-called higher order theory of mind tasks on AI. What are these tests? Like basically, if you want to know, let's say, if a monkey has meta-representational abilities, so if they have the ability to realize that other, let's say, other monkeys or other individuals have mental states and that these mental states change in response to their behavior, etc., there are some tasks that we can perform. And if the animal passes the task, or a baby or a human being or whatever, we infer that this agent has meta-representational ability. They have the capacity to represent other minds as having mental states. So of course, this is not a foolproof test. It's just more like an indicator. But so far, let's say the evidence came in, we run this test on LLMs, and what they show is that they do, in fact, have meta-representational abilities. And in fact, in some cases, they outperform adult humans. So there's even maybe a case to be made that they have better meta-representational abilities than us. Of course, the evidence is still mixed, but I would say that any argument that goes like, oh, meta-representation is the reason why machines can't assert, won't have a very strong case because of these studies that have been done. An alternative reply that we might have in response to the Gricean analysis, so the strong version of intentionalism, is that while I did mention that there is a lot of disagreement about what the conditions for asserting are, and which one is the right philosophical analysis of assertion. It does seem that there is fairly decent consensus between philosophers that the Gricean requirement that you have to intend to persuade your audience in virtue of them recognizing your intention is not really a necessary condition for asserting. So basically, you can assert also if you don't have this intention. And here you have a very text-filled slide with a bunch of, let's say, counterexamples to the idea that the Gricean intention is required for asserting. And I'm not going to read it all, but basically, some of the objections are that, for instance, if you remind someone of something, you're not trying to persuade them. Or if you are speaking in a way that is meant for your audience not to understand you, like maybe you want to confuse them, or maybe you just expect them not to understand you because they don't speak your language, or because they are distracted, etc., or maybe they're unconscious. Sometimes you simply write without an intended audience in mind, such as when you write stuff on a diary, etc. So basically, since the Gricean account is so audience-centered, and it's based on a particular reaction on the audience, so you have to intend to cause a particular reaction on the audience. And there are so many examples of communications that doesn't aim at that particular reaction, is still assertoric, or doesn't even have an audience, then it can't be true that assertion requires a Gricean intention. Now, to be fair to the Griceans and the Neo-Griceans, some of these objections have been dealt with in the literature, but it's still true that many others haven't been dealt. So a good reply that we can offer is saying, look, this Gricean intention is just not required for assertion. So it's not a problem. Even if AI weren't able to form this intention, it's not going to be a problem. I think a much better case against AI assertion is to insist for weak intentionalism. And of course, some reply can be offered here as well, but I think we can perhaps at most go for a partial defense, so a sort of proto-assertion defense, arguing that AI goes close maybe to have intention. Now, if you follow Dennett and some other authors and think that assertion is something like goal-directed control over action, you might even think that machines can have intention in the full sense, in the fullest possible sense. So what's the idea here is that, well, an agent can be said to have an intention whenever they can determine a certain goal, and they can adjust their behavior to achieve that goal. And attributing a goal to this agent is also a good way of predicting how they're going to behave. So agents with intentions are also the kind of agents for which it will be useful to ascribe a goal to them and then explain their behavior as a behavior that is meant to achieve this goal. And if you think like standard cases such as artificial intelligence playing chess, clearly they have a goal here, which is to beat you at chess, and clearly they adjust their behavior. So for every single possible move on the chessboard, they're going to consider all the options. They're going to select the option that is most likely to lead them to the goal of beating you, of checkmating your king. And so they engage in this selection of possible courses of action based on a certain goal in a fairly obvious way. So if this is all there is to intention, as some philosophers say, well, then clearly AI can have intention, even old-fashioned AI. You don't need to go as sophisticated as LLMs. On the other hand, we might say, well, it's still very different from human intention, right? Because, for instance, human intention is something that, we sort of have a drive, an internal drive for things. We set our own goals, so to say, whereas machines are programmed to achieve certain goals, or they are prompted, when we write a prompt, for an LLM. So what you see there is that there is still perhaps a difference in the source of these goals, and perhaps also what machines lack is a genuine desire for achieving the goal, maybe some emotional component to intention that they lack. But still, we might wonder, well, is this an emotional component, or is this internal drive the kind of component of intention that is necessary for asserting, or is it just something that is part of our human concept of intention? But when we say that machines should have intention in order to assert, we don't mean intention in this fullest sense of like being accompanied by cognitive states or being internally driven. It's something that is up for debate. So I think that maybe this is a case in which we can argue for a proto-assertion with a sort of fairly small gap, or at least something that can be argued for. So much for intentional account. Now, just very quickly on conventions. I think you can, when it comes to conventions, you can argue that conventions are necessary for asserting in two ways. And the first is a fairly obvious way. You can say, look, there are conventions such that you produce some sounds, some scribblings on a piece of paper, and then by conventions, these are not just sounds, they're not just scribbles, they have a meaning. Certain sounds refer to certain letters, and the letters put together refer to certain words, and then there are conventions in syntax, and from there you get to the meaning of the whole sentence. So certain kind of physical objects count as an assertion because of some conventions. And then you can say also, well, maybe it's more sophisticated than that. There are also some social conventions, so to say, so that making an assertion counts as bringing about some social fact, like, for instance, undertaking a responsibility, etc. So these are the sort of more complex analyses that are conventionalist. So we're going to analyze both, and some will be phrased in terms of an official effect. We will see that in a second. So when it comes to linguistic convention in the first sense, in the fairly simple sense of getting from a scribble to a meaningful sentence, I think that there is very little argument to be made against AI assertion in this weak sense. So it seems fairly clear that machines can produce a text that is consistent with our linguistic convention in such a way that when we look at these pixels on the screen, so to say, we can recover a certain meaningful sentence. So I don't think, like you can offer a sophisticated philosophical argument for why these text appearing on your screen when you talk to ChatGPT is not really meaningful, but there's also a clear sense in which it is meaningful in the sense of satisfying the linguistic conventions for creating a sentence and so forth. Some authors talk about a phenomenological equivalence of the sentences produced by LLMs and the ones produced by human, in the sense that they feel the same, they look the same, they feel the same. And the reason why probably has to do with these linguistic conventions that clearly AI is able to mimic. So if we want to offer a conventionalist analysis of AI assertion, probably we need to go a little bit deeper and see if on top of this, there are some other conventions that are required for asserting that machines might not be able to satisfy. And these is going to bring us to the rest of the views that I haven't discussed yet. So what you see here is a little bit of a map of existing accounts of assertion. And if we want to, let's say, consider on a sort of conventionalist perspective, from a conventionalist perspective, whether AI can assert, then we have to sort of check all this theory of assertion and see for each one of them if it might be the case that AI can assert. So first of all, we have descriptive accounts, which are focused not on the norms governing assertion, but maybe on more descriptive properties. And you might think that assertion has to do with like requires presenting a proposition as true. Self-representation means representing yourself as believing that what you're saying is true. Then updating a common ground is a little bit more complex. We're going to tackle it in a little while. And then there are normative accounts, which basically focus on the norms that assertions are subject to and the kind of obligations that they generate. So some authors say that to assert is to perform a speech act that is subject to a specific norm, a little bit like playing chess is to, engage in a game that is subject to specific norms that are not do not apply to other games. And then last account is that you assert when you take responsibility for the truth of what you're saying. So what I'm going to do now in the second half of the talk is review these theories and then sort of wrap up these different theories and then wrap up and see, let's see, sort of general overview of which accounts predict that AI can assert and which don't. I'll start with assertion as self-expressing because I think that it brings out some essential features that are gonna, like quite clearly, that are gonna then appear also in the analysis of other potential analysis of assertion that apply to AI. So the idea here is that communication is this sort of magical tool that allows us to share our mental state with each other. If we didn't have the ability to communicate, we would sort of live in our own world, in our own mind, locked in our own mind. But what can we do when we communicate? Oh, we can sort of show other people what we are thinking. So to assert it is basically to let other people see what we are believing. So assertion is a tool to express our beliefs, to let the world know what we believe. This is the idea behind the self-expressing account. So when you assert, you represent yourself as being in a certain mental state. And, Griceans sometimes use the term expression as well to refer to these Gricean mechanisms, this intention to persuade the audience, etc. They call it expression of a mental state. But we already covered that. So when I talk about accounts of assertion as self-expressing, I'm talking about any account that says that to assert is to express a belief, but doesn't rely on the Gricean mechanism that I've explained earlier. So why would we think that machines can't assert in this sense? Well, this account doesn't say that explicitly that you have to believe the proposition, because clearly you could lie and you could still express a belief. So a liar expresses a belief because they represent themselves as believing something, even if they don't believe it. So it's possible to assert even if you don't have the belief. So here we can't really build the same argument as in the case of intention, that we really require that the machine has the intention, because here, you could assert also without the belief. So maybe what we could object is to say, look, even if this account doesn't require belief for every assertion, it probably does require that you are the kind of entity that can form beliefs, because if you're not the kind of entity that can form belief, then let's say that you try to represent yourself as believing what you're saying. For instance, you might represent yourself as believing, oh, there's a glass on the table, by saying there is a glass on the table. Well, if I know you're not the kind of thing that can believe something, then it's going to be hard for me to take you seriously when you attempt to represent yourself as believing something. This is something that we call sometimes in speech act theory a misfire. What's a misfire? Misfire is when a speaker attempts to communicate something, but this so obviously violates some requirement for communicating something that we reinterpret their initial attempt as something else. So this happens, for instance, when you assert something that is obviously false, when you claim something that is obviously false, or here in the slide, you have the case of an obviously unaccomplishable promise. So if I tell you, oh yeah, I promise that tomorrow I will just flap my arms and fly to the moon. You know, if I say something like this, it's not like you're gonna hold me accountable for my promise, and in 3 days you're gonna be like, oh, Neri, the other day you promised that you would fly to the moon, but then how come you didn't go there? It's just like the standard effects that would follow from making a promise, like taking responsibility for this and being liable to be criticized if I don't do it, are not gonna be brought about. You're not gonna be entitled to criticize me. And probably what is gonna happen is that you're gonna think that I was ironic or that I was doing something else. You're gonna try to make sense of what I'm saying in some other way. You're not gonna interpret it as a genuine promise. So the idea here from the misfire argument is that since machines are not the kind of thing that can form a belief, then they probably should be unable to assert, because it is so obvious that they cannot satisfy a required condition for asserting, that we would probably fail to interpret these attempts to assert as attempts to represent themselves as believing something, right? So machines are not the kind of thing that can believe something. So it just wouldn't make sense for them to represent themselves as believing something, and we could not interpret them as attempting to do that. So what is the problem for this reply? Well, first of all, while in the case of the failed promise, there's a clear sense, you know, like I say, you say, I promise I will fly to the moon, and immediately there's something awkward, something odd about you saying that, and I clearly, you know, reinterpret your attempted promise as an ironic statement or something else, or maybe I'm just going to ask you, what's going on? Why are you doing this? This doesn't make any sense. This promise doesn't make any sense. You're going to have this reaction. It's going to, like, there's going to be something weird about what you did, and this is going to prompt corrections, let's say, to the scoreboard. So we're going to try to see what you were trying to do. We're going to try to clarify. We're going to ask for clarification. The same doesn't happen when you, let's say, chat with ChatGPT. It's not like people who interact with chatbots are all the time, you know, having the same reactions and be like, oh, that's weird. What do you mean? You know, the GDP of France has increased by whatever amount. You're not the kind of entity that can have beliefs. So why are you writing that? We don't have this kind of reactions that are prompted by odd speech act or by misfire. So the prediction of the misfire argument is that it should sound odd for us, but it doesn't really sound odd for us. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the argument seems to rest on a wrong assumption. The idea here is that it should be the case that when you openly violate some felicity condition for a speech act, the result is a misfire. So whenever performing a certain speech act has a certain requirement and you openly violated that requirement, it should be odd. It should be the case that you can't really manage to communicate what you're trying to communicate. But we do know that, as a matter of fact, this doesn't always happen. So in the case of blatant lying, this has been widely discussed in the literature on lying and philosophy. So what we have in mind is a kind of case in which, you know, like your friend has been caught red-handed, let's say, stealing your cookies from your cookie jar. And they insist, oh, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. You know, they're covered in crumbs, but they just keep repeating that it wasn't them. In this case, they're not really trying to persuade you. They're clearly blatantly violating the conditions for a good assertion, but still you interpret them as making a genuine assertion. So it's not the case that, you know, even if we can't ascribe a belief, it immediately follows that the person cannot make an assertion. So also this premise of the misfire argument doesn't really fly. Finally, we can argue that AI can have genuine belief, just like poor intention. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there are several theories that would deliver this prediction. First of all, we have dispositionalist theory. This is a little bit similar to the account of intention that we reviewed early, the idea is that to have a belief is a disposition to act in a way that is consistent with this belief. So for instance, I don't eat cheese. So if I believe that some food has cheese in it, I will behave in a way that is consistent with this belief. So for instance, I will just refrain from eating this food because I believe it contains cheese. So to ascribe a belief is just to, see what kind of things I would do on the basis of treating this proposition as true. So clearly, machines, LLMs, have belief in the sense of behaving in ways that are consistent with some proposition being taken to be true, or at least could, have belief. They have the potential of having belief in this sense. Also, functionalist account of belief that were developed precisely by drawing analogies between computer and humans, and actually, represented humans' belief on the basis of how machines tend to operate, would deliver the predictions that AI is capable of forming genuine belief. Or the representationalist view, which basically says that to have a belief is to represent certain objects, properties, and relationships, and then update them on evidence. For this view, I think there might be a stronger case against AI belief, even though some authors have argued in favor at least of a proto-belief or something like a belief in machines. So just to wrap up, also if we thought that the misfire argument has some value to it, we can still argue that machines is something like human belief. Okay, so now that we have this structure of objection and reply, we can apply to some of the other views that have been presented in the literature. Now, when it comes to the view of assertion as presenting as true, I think we can sort of go very quickly through it. The idea is that you make an assertion when you communicate that a proposition is true. So for instance, that's the difference between, like merely mentioning something, like, let's say you sing under the shower, a sentence like, today is going to be a wonderful day. You're just singing, you're not making a claim, you're not communicating that this content is true. And that's different from an assertion. You only make an assertion when on top of producing these sounds, you're also communicating that the proposition is true. If you think that the way of doing that is having a certain intention, you are once again an intentionalist. But from the conventionalist perspective, the idea is that you present as true when certain conventions apply, you pronounce these words in the right way, in the right context. And clearly, there are no obvious obstacles for machines not to be able of satisfying these conventions themselves. So I don't think there is a strong case to be made here, at least no obvious objection to asserting as presenting as true in this weak sense. Now, we might consider a very similar view, which is assertion as updating the common ground. So the idea here is that when we communicate, we, let's say, engage in a conversation, we're all sitting at a table. What is a conversation? Is to just discuss what is true. That's at least a philosopher's concept of a conversation. And as we make contributions to the conversation, we're basically proposing that a certain proposition, that what we just said, is added to the list of things that are accepted as true for the purpose of the conversation. So we call this the common ground. The common ground is the set of propositions that we accept as true for the purpose of the conversation. Whenever we make an assertion, we are making a proposal. We're saying, oh, let's add to the list of true things this thing that I just said. So it's a proposal to add to the list of true things, so to say. And so it's very similar to the present as true account, right? But in this case, we might wonder whether there is an objection that is very similar to the one we considered in relation to belief. So if you remember, the objection for representing yourself as believing account of assertion was that the machine doesn't have the right internal state. They don't have the belief, and so it should fail, it should misfire. It should be obvious that what they're trying to do is not the kind of thing that they can do. Perhaps we could claim that the same is going on here. The machine is proposing that a certain content is accepted as true for the purpose of the conversation, but the machine cannot accept proposition as true because they don't have the right internal states. So they're just not the kind of entity that can participate in the conversation, that can, be part of these people sitting at the table, accepting true things, adding them to the list. Since they can't accept content as true, they can't really engage in conversation. I think that here the argument is very weak. One of the reasons why it's very weak is that unlike the self-expressions account, which said you must express a belief in the proposition, so there's this more success condition. In this case, we are talking about proposal to accept. So you make an assertion as long as you propose that a certain proposition is accepted as true. Even if you're not the kind of entity that can accept as true, I think it's probably going to be the case that you can propose that a proposition is accepted as true. So I don't see an argument there that can prove that a machine would not even be able to propose that the proposition is accepted as true. Additionally, we could just revise the view a little bit. We would say, well, actually nothing essential to the Stalnackerian account, to this account of assertion as common ground, trades on the word accepted. When we say accepted in this case, what we really mean is that we are treating a proposition as true. So we can just have a behavioralist paraphrasis of the required condition, and it would still capture each and every case that the old account captures. So there's nothing essential to this view that trades on internal states like acceptance, and really what we're talking about is treating proposition as true. So if we give this interpretation, then we're no longer talking about internal states, and so we evade the objection just by bypassing it and not requiring internal states. Now, a final account that I want to review is this family of accounts that say that to assert is to be subject to a certain norm. So you must assert only proposition that you know, for instance, or that you believe, or that you're justified to believe. And the idea here is that assertion would be a bit like other games which have an essential rule. So, like to be a bishop is to be the kind of piece that can only move diagonally. To be an assertion is to be the kind of speech act that can only be performed when you know something. This is the idea. There is a lot of disagreement about which one of the state is actually required. And if you think that the required state is something like truth, then it's an external state. And I don't really see why machines wouldn't be able to perform the speech act. Whereas perhaps if we're talking about some internal state, something like the misfire argument. So, if the norm is belief, and you should only assert what you believe, then the account comes very close to the self-expression account. And then we can sort of plug in all the objections and replies that we're applying to belief into these alternative accounts. So the same objections and reply would apply here. And when it comes to knowledge and justification, maybe you have slightly more sophisticated requirements. So maybe you have a stronger case against AI assertion than the account based on belief. On the other hand, you might think, look, machines are just not the kind of thing that can be subject to a norm. And we're going to deal with this objection together with the last theory of assertion, which is theory of assertion as commitment. So the idea here is that to assert a proposition is to commit yourself to a proposition being the case. So take responsibility for something being true. You You take responsibility for what you communicate. And what does it mean to take responsibility? Well, you have these two philosophers here with very long beards. The one on the bottom right is Bob Brandom, which basically spells out the requirement that you must undertake responsibility as an expectation that you will back up your claim with reasons if challenged. So for instance, if I say tomorrow is going to rain, you can challenge me and say, how do you know that? Or why do you think that? And since I took responsibility, I now have an obligation to clarify how do I know it? What kind of evidence do I have in support of my claim, or else retract it? So this expectation that I back up my claim is a sign that I took responsibility for people who understand assertoric responsibility in the way that Brandomian philosophers do. But some people follow the guy on the top left, Charles Peirce, who rather focuses on sanctions. And he says, look, the mark of making an assertion is that you can be criticized if it turns out to be false. So when you make an assertion, it's a little bit like you sign a contract. If you say tomorrow it will rain, then it's like you signed a contract. It's like, oh, I warrant that tomorrow will rain, and you can criticize me if it doesn't. And there are some consequences as well, you know, like you might face retaliation in the future. You might damage your friendships. Your reputation might suffer if you communicate false things, if you assert false things. So this is take a responsibility as accountability. And then there are some broader sense of responsibility. So for instance, if you say tomorrow it will rain to your friend, and then your friend cancels their plans for going to the beach, let's say, then there's a sense in which you are responsible for what they have done that isn't quite captured by the first or the second account. So I think that if you want to argue that machines are responsible for what they communicate in the Brandomian sense, there's the decent case to be made there, because you can argue that, you know, actually you expect them to back up their claim. I don't know how you interact with LLMs, with ChatGPT or whatever, but I get mad sometimes if they don't consistently reply to my challenges, etc. So there's definitely a sense in which we expect them to engage in this game of asking and giving reasons. When it comes to accountability, like whether we can really hold them accountable, criticize them, etc., this is contested. It's more debatable. A paper by Butlin and Phoebe argues that the reason why we can't hold them accountable is that machines don't have feelings, so to say, they don't feel guilty, etc., and they lack an affective component of commitment. I think that this is a bit ad hoc, because, you know, in about 100 years in which accounts of assertion were developed, nobody ever required an affective component. So to add it just when machine comes in to be able to say, oh no, they can't assert, seems a bit like an excuse to push them out of the game. But still, I think there's an important takeaway, which is that machines aren't really quite motivated by the same incentives that motivate us to be truthful. And so perhaps they're still pointing out something interesting there. Still, I would also say that they do have incentives to be truthful, because fine-tuning, like the training that they go through, does have some relation to truth, so that machines are sort of given negative feedback when they say false things, so they have some incentive to be truthful. A sort of more all-encompassing argument against machine being able to undertake assertoric commitment is that they're simply not the kind of thing that can. So some people might say, look, a self-driving car kills a baby. Very sad, but is it the car's fault or is it the company's fault? We would say that it's definitely the company's fault. It's the company that takes responsibility for the machine's action. So why would we think that machines are different? Some philosophers run this line of argument and they say, look, machines can assert, but they can only assert on behalf of humans, because they take responsibility for the humans. They're like speaking for us. They're not speaking for themselves. And sometimes there is this terminology that is taken from Goffman, which I find very useful to explain what goes on when machines speak for us. So Goffman was distinguishing when we have a spokesperson, like let's say a person who speaks on behalf of someone else, on behalf of the President of the United States or on behalf of the company, the person who they speak for, let's say the President of the United States, is called the principal, the person who generates the ideas and the text that has to be then presented by the proxy, by the spokesperson. And the interesting distinction here is between an animator who just repeats what they're told. So a full sentence is constructed and then this person has to just read it, say. So in this case, the spokesperson is an animator, but sometimes a spokesperson has to improvise and restructure what they are being told, like pass on the general message, but not quite a specific one. And in this sense, we talk about an author instead of animator. So I think there is no doubt that there are artificial animators. So if you're taking a train in some station, you will often hear these messages that machines just repeat. And clearly here they are engaging in proxy speech. The machine is speaking for the human, and there is no question about that. Sometimes we have something more like an author. So this is my personal nightmare when I have to interact with my online bank and I have to engage with conversations with this chatbot. Here, the chatbot is more like an author in the sense that they're not just reading a pre-stated message, but they're still taking responsibility for, it's the company who's taking responsibility for what they communicate in a very clear sense. Now, when it comes to LLMs, you know, if I ask Claude, as in this case, to write a song for my presentation on whether AI can generally assert, there is no sense, I would say, in which Anthropic, the company behind Claude, is taking responsibility for the utterances that the chatbot is producing in the same sense in which my bank might, or in the same sense in which the train company might. So what's the issue here? The issue here is that if we are conceptualizing proxy assertion as the kind of thing that machines do when the company or some human takes the responsibility for what they are saying, then we would have that in the case of chatbots, nobody is really taking responsibility for the utterance and the machine isn't asserting. And some, you know, like some companies are quite clear. Actually, most companies go out of their way to clarify that their chatbots are not, the outputs of their chatbots is not something they take responsibility for. And ChatGPT itself will be warning you that this is exactly how things work. So if we want an account based on commitment, the proxy view is probably not the way to go. It's not going to be a good way of arguing that machines can assert. I would say that to wrap up, when it comes to commitment, machines are probably capable of discursive responsibility, but when it comes to accountability, something is clearly missing. They don't really face genuine social cost. When we talk about reputation, I don't have time to discuss this, but it's a bit, you know, since you interact with a different context window every time and softwares are updated constantly, the concept of reputation is just weird when it comes to AI. And perhaps we're lacking the right normative underpinnings. Maybe they are not the kind of things that can take responsibility. So just a bit of recap, because I noticed that I'm over time now. Sorry if I can't go fully in detail about the commitment view. Here, what you see is a general summary of whether or not we had a decent defense for AI assertion. As you can see, like basically we reviewed a lot of accounts. I think we did a good job today. We managed to see different theories of assertion. And we saw that the majority of them actually are compatible with AI assertion. At the same time, there are some obstacles. And even though, you know, like it might look like a very favorable case for AI assertion, like, oh, the majority of assertion views predicts or at least is compatible with AI assertion, or it would be very difficult to argue against AI assertion from the perspective of this account. On the other hand, you should think, oh, all these views are views about necessary conditions. So you might think that perhaps they're all necessary for asserting, and missing just one is all we need for AI assertion to be impossible. So it's not so clear that the case is looking so rosy, but surely if we are going for a more pluralist view, which says, oh, look, we might talk about assertion in many different ways, and one way in which we could talk about assertion doesn't involve the intention requirement or the commitment required, then it does seem that there is at least a sense or a few senses in which AI can assert. So this perhaps is taking a little bit more of the quasi-assertion way of arguing in favor of AI assertion, in the sense in which we would say, well, if we want to include assertions within the realm of entities that can engage, if we want to include AI within the realm of entities that can assert, then we have to go for an account of assertion that doesn't include between these necessary condition commitment or intention. On the other hand, like even when we consider commitment and intention, what we saw is not a full dismissal of AI's ability to form intentions or to form commitments. So we might even go for an account that does require them and is, let's say, lenient when it comes to what it requires for having an intentions or for being committed to a proposition. Okay, so I'll close here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neri. Now, as usual, there are two ways to ask questions in the Q&A. You can either use the raise your hand function, and then I can just ask you to ask the question either on camera or by audio. If you would rather put your question into the chat, then you can also do that as well, and I will read the question out and allow Neri to respond. So you've got two options here. You can either use raise your hand and ask a question, or if you have questions, you can put them into the chat instead. So are there any questions from the audience? Does anyone want to raise their hand or put a question into the... yes, we have a chat from Salima. So yes, please ask your question.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for this insightful talk. I learned a lot from it. But I don't know if I was missing it or not, but I don't know if you've heard of interactionist views on speech acts. So maybe let's start there before I go into a full-blown explanation of what it is, and maybe you already know.
I think I know what you mean.
Okay, because then how would you look at an interactionist's point of view on what a speech act is in comparison to AI? So what I'm thinking of specifically is how we as humans, when we sometimes make an assertion, we don't finish it. So, oh, I see A, and then somebody else says tree, and together you've made an assertion at that point. At least that's what they are committing to. AI doesn't really do this. I've tried. It usually just tells me, oh, I'll wait, or you didn't finish your sentence. So, like, how would you then, look at that?
Okay, so I guess there are different ways of going interactionist. Perhaps I was thinking about something slightly different. In a previous version of this talk, in which I reviewed more accounts, I consider those accounts that I called uptake accounts of assertion or speech acts in general, which, let's say, set some requirement that is based on the reaction of the audience. So you make an assertion only if I interpret your contribution as an assertion, if I have certain reactions to your assertion, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, there has been some work being done that was compatible with those views. So there's this paper by, or at least I interpret it that way, but this paper by Fintan Mallory, which talks about like fictionalism about assertion. Basically, the idea there being that we make believe that these entities are fully capable of asserting and communicating. And so we still engage and go through the motions of a real conversation. So it's just sort of like something more similar to a game of make-believe. But the idea is that we do react in that way, in a sense. And I would say that that goes in the right direction. So if the requirement is, if it is the audience that completes the speech act, so to say, by having a certain reaction to the original speech act, then I would say that most people interact that in a way that is phenomenologically indiscernible from the way to which we react to human speech, at least most of the time. So I would think that it's not a major obstacle against AI assertion. Then what you're talking about maybe is slightly different, because you're talking about cases in which we come in to complete an incomplete sentence, so that the machine has only done part of the assertion. But I would say that perhaps that has to do more with syntax and semantics than the pragmatics of it. So perhaps it proves, I would say, maybe something more specific about a subset of cases. So I think it still could be interesting, but I'm not sure if it is going to be like a litmus test, or the machines can complete the sentence, so it's definitely not an assertion. And I'm not sure also that we could have like that there's a theory of assertion that predicts that that's required.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. No, I was just saying, if you want to clarify something, or if I misrepresented what you said, please feel free to rectify.
No, I do actually believe in partially in what you're saying, especially like the litmus test. Like it could boil down to that, but I think most interactionists, at least that I've read from, so that is Clark and Streeck, they mostly represented also as a joint action, like communication, language, speech acts. They're all subordinate to the joint action that we're trying to at least complete. Maybe subordinate is maybe too big of a word, but in the sense of like what we're trying to do in that moment is basically talk about a tree, for example. And therefore, if I say, oh, there is that is done in favor of, or to complete the joint goal that we have to talk about the tree, and you finishing that sentence is done as an individual action to complete that joint action in that sense. So like there are steps to this, and it is very integral to that theory that we are all that if we are talking, if we're using language, then we are doing that in favor of a certain goal, a joint goal. Otherwise it would just be an individual goal. So for example, lying or whatever it is, that doesn't really sometimes not fit into the theory, but it is then like it's just something different. I don't know, I was not really that much I didn't find that much theory on lying and misrepresentations or other stuff like that. But the general idea, I think, would be that to complete the joint action, you would need an action from an individual, in this case, the AI, that furthers the joint goal. So maybe in that way, by asking, or by saying, I'll wait, or by doing, I don't know what AI otherwise would do, by saying, I'll wait, they are furthering the goal by just saying that they will delay their response in a way, that they will delay their action, their part of the action to the conversation. But I don't know if that's satisfactory in a way.
Yeah. So I think maybe this points towards perhaps a proto-assertion view, if you really think that's crucial. So perhaps, machines are in the way of developing this ability. I think it's a very interesting test, and I'm going to be curious, like to play around with it myself and see what they do. But I do think that they're able to, for instance, they perfectly understand adjacency pairs. So they respond to a question with an answer. They clearly they might not complete sentences or pass this subtest, but there are many other tests that involve like jointly making a conversation and participating to it in such a way that by giving me a response, you kind of build meaning with me, and we go along step to step to sort of come out with more complex interpretation of what the previous speech act amounted to. I think they do a lot of that. So I would say, okay, maybe it's not full marks for AI, but at least a decent capability to perform these basic interactions through subsequent conversational steps. They were really bad in the beginning because they kept forgetting what was going on at previous conversational steps. But I think now they're faring fairly well. So but it is a nice thought. Thanks for this suggestion.
Yeah, thank you as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next question is from Chris. Chris, please ask your question.
Hey, Neri, thanks for a really interesting talk. You said a few times, if we're going to be pluralists, certain kinds of things follow, like LLMs can probably do some asserting on some views. Should we be pluralists about what's required for asserting or speech acts in general?
Yeah. You mean as a general theory? So, like, can you consistently be a pluralist?
So if we're going to say, well, LLMs can assert if we're going to be pluralist about what's required for assertion, should we? And then is that going to feed back into what we say about human assertions or like illocutionary force more widely? Like, is it just going to turn out that there's, in different contexts or for different purposes, we should be adopting different accounts of assertion or different accounts of illocutionary force, and that there isn't going to be just one answer that's going to tell us, or there's going to be different accounts that we should use in different circumstances. Sometimes that will give us the result that LLMs can assert, and then that will also mean that in different human interactions, we should be using different theories of assertion. We shouldn't just be looking for one.
I see. Look, first of all, I would like to rectify the first statement. So you were like, oh, if we are pluralist, then machines assert. I think pluralism is sort of it cuts both ways. It's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, we have more views of assertion, so there are at least one sense in which the machine could satisfy the condition or whatever. On the other hand, all these views they're like laying out necessary conditions for asserting. So if we accept both of them, actually we get the maximally demanding account, which will definitely not allow AI. So first, I guess AI assertion. So first, I guess we have to be maybe more precise of what we mean by pluralism. Is it at the acceptance of these necessary conditions all at once, or what else then? I would say I introduced pluralism as more like a methodological approach for investigating this possibility. So if machines were able to assert, in which sense would they be able to assert? So I took it not to be like a form of taking a stance and being, well, as a matter of fact, all these accounts are equally good. But it was more like, well, given the disagreement about which of these accounts is good, the best way to explore this question is to first lay out all the possibilities, and then we are going to have the conceptual map laid out, and we are going to be able to draw conclusions that are not merely the reflection of a theoretical commitment, as it happens when we go monist. So that's one thing. Obviously, I guess another worry that you raised is that it's going to generate some sort of uncertainty, or it's not going to give us a clear verdict, or maybe it could be used in different ways in different contexts. So in all these senses, it might be like let's say a suboptimal account. It's like, oh, I have this monist option. Well, it's sorted. Now we know if AI can assert, for regulatory purposes or whatever goal we might want to ask that question. We have a solution to the question. Whereas with the pluralist, it just becomes a little bit of a, I guess, an anarchy where we could just pick and choose the account that give us the verdict that we want. And so that's a sort of unsatisfactory result. So I think you're right about that. If that's what you were trying to say, I don't know. Maybe I put it to your most thing that you were saying. But I would say that maybe in that respect, I would regard my my work as something on the way of a solution to the problem. So it's like, oh, now that we have this map laid out, maybe we can make further progress by throwing in arguments about like, oh, maybe for regulatory purposes, we should rely on these accounts rather than these others. And for these other purposes, maybe a different. So yeah, you were maybe trying to clarify.
Mostly to agree, except to the extent that that's necessarily an undesirable direction to be going. I think that not that we should just accept all the accounts of assertion. There'll be some that probably don't work, but that for different purposes, it might be really good for us to say, for regulatory purposes or for legal enforcement, we might have different accounts of assertion than we do for putting each other on the hook in sort of ordinary conversation. So yeah, I sort of agree with the direction and maybe more optimistically than you were suggesting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have two more questions in the queue. The first one is from Meryl. Meryl, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Neri. That was a great talk, a great overview. I actually had a very similar question as Chris, but so I'll go to a different question. So this is about when you were talking about whether AIs can make proposals to update the common ground, whether they can accept propositions, right? And then you said that acceptance is not a mental state, and that puzzled me a bit. This is probably because I'm a bit brainwashed by Stalnaker, who says that acceptance is something that encompasses belief and entertaining and supposing and all of these things, and all of that. All of these are mental states, right? So I'm just wondering then, do you not agree with Stalnaker in that sense? You have this different understanding of acceptance, so to treat a proposition as true for the conversation. And then if that is the understanding, how similar is that to a normative account of common ground in terms of commitments? If that is the understanding of acceptance.
Nice. Okay. So first of all, I'm not allowed to disagree with Stalnaker. I think it's like he laid out a theory, and either we're talking about the same thing or we're talking about another thing, and then I'm coming up with my own version of it. So I think you're right that he phrases it in terms that are, let's say, mentalistic, or at least like it is a mental state. It's like weaker than belief, similar to this other thing. It encompasses all these mental states. So I think you're right about all that. What I was suggesting, and perhaps I wasn't clear in suggesting it, is that we could go for a quasi-assertion move. I was a bit of a speed running. I was very short in the first, very slow in the first part of the presentation, so I did the second a bit fast, and some details were lost. But the idea there was like, I think a move is open to defend the possibility of AI assertion that goes in the direction of conceptual engineering. And the direction would be, let's change. So in that case, it would be changing. Let's change the theory a little bit into something else, which is treating as in lieu of accepting. It is different, yes. One was a mental requirement, the other one isn't. But I would think that it does capture the same cases. So in all the cases in which we accept it, well, if you're a dispositionalist about acceptance, then you're gonna have that result, right? So if accepting in the end is just treating as true or something like it, it's a disposition to treat a proposition as true, then you get that result. So the idea would be that we would not be introducing a substantial change into the view. So it would be, yes, it would be conceptual engineering in the sense that we change the concept a little bit if the right concept is the Stalnackerian one. But the change that we introduce is so small that it would be one of those cases where the gap is between the original concept and the revised concept is very little, so that the move could easily be justified as, oh, look, that was an anthropocentric way of phrasing things, but once we adapt it a little bit, we're not like doing anything revolutionary, and we get the result that AI is asserting at a very low price.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that clarifies it. But I mean, so you can also just say going for a different notion of common ground, right? So like along the lines of Gert's normative notion of common ground, and then you have the same framework. You're not really, so for a theorist like that is assertion, right? And that's all that. So you're still working with a version of the common ground theory as it is, and you don't have to change it, I guess, to make your point.
Okay. Yes, I guess that could be also an option.
Yeah.
But I guess in the end, it's a similar move,
Yeah.
I would say.
No, yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and our final question is from Jiwon. Jiwon, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. My main question is, what's at stake for saying that ChatGPT or LLMs are capable of performing a speech act? So I also want to say it seems like at least they are asserting or asking a question or whatever. But I'm also very convinced by the paper, ChatGPT's bullshit paper, that it's just a continuation of string of text, and actually by design, it is not designed to convey truth. So what's at stake? If we think that Hicks et al., the ChatGPT's bullshit paper is right, is it something well, then we tend to be more cautious about what ChatGPT is saying because they're bullshitting, or if we buy the pluralist account of yours, then are we is it more we tend to think, well, actually ChatGPT is actually trying to produce some kind of assertion, or they convey truth in some way, so we tend to trust it a bit more. Yeah, so what's at stake?
Yeah, okay. So these are kind of two different questions, right? So one was what's at stake in the broader debate on why are we asking whether these LLMs, these chatbots are capable of communicating? And the other one is, shouldn't we think that their outputs are just not genuine communication or not genuine assertion because they're stochastic parrots or whatever? I guess concerning the first kind of question, I think there are two answers. I think the first answer is that it's interesting I call the paper Rethinking Assertion in the Age of AI because I think that considering entities such as chatbots and considering whether they could be able to contribute to conversation with genuine assertions forces us to rethink our conceptual toolbox and to question whether certain constructs or certain concepts that we adopt, notion, etc., parts of our theory, moving parts of our theory of what language is, what communication is, on the basis of, these entities, that whatever it is, whatever it does, it comes very close to doing something that seems similar to what we do when we communicate. So I think it is an interesting question to be asked insofar as it can like put some, it's like a stress test on our theories of speech acts, etc. And it's a good stimulus to really see whether we wanted to use this conceptual armamentary, or maybe we want to revise it a little bit. And on the other hand, I think there's a genuine question of interest about what they're doing. So we are now dealing with new technologies that are starting to do a lot of things, like driving, I don't know, killing people, and talking. And we want to know exactly what's going on here. And I think there are implications that go well beyond. First of all, there's the pure philosophical curiosity, I would say. It's just interesting. And then there are also repercussions. So for instance, we were talking about like taking responsibility. What could it mean for them to do so? So I think, as it often happens, by considering these issues, we also end up touching on other issues that have clear like legal repercussions, etc. So I don't think it's let's say without stakes, as you began with. What are the stakes? I think there are stakes of different kinds, and it is a topic that, but it is also a question that I get a lot. So fair enough. I think I gave the talk a couple of other times, and it's a common question. What about the bullshit argument? I mean, I have to say I wasn't equally convinced by the paper. I think it is definitely true, right? That, and I think we briefly touched upon it, like machines aren't quite building sentences in the same ways that we do. And they seem to have this problem with truth and hallucinations that has plagued them for a while now. ChatGPT is still pretty bad. Some other companies are doing better at fine-tuning their machines. But I would also say that the image of LLMs as a mere like a software that completes the sentence with the highest probability next word that's going to come out, I think that right now is a bit updated. They're starting to be designed with more and more sophisticated technology behind them. So I think that argument maybe might fly before, but now it would need like a lot more on top of it to be able to be persuasive. On the other hand, as hallucination still is a thing and still does seem to point in the direction of, well, these machines don't really, let's say, form sentences on the basis of heuristics that are remotely similar to the ones that we use when we form a sentence. So I think that shows that, they're truly alien, but I am not sure that it shows that what they are engaging is just pure nonsense. Perhaps there's some middle ground there between these two extremes, and I would be interested in exploring it more. So I hope I've given you some food for thoughts for potential options to find a middle ground. But well, if I didn't persuade you, maybe next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, when part of one thought I had during this, and this is a more comic thought than it is a serious philosophical thought, but I thought one of the things which is interesting when you were talking about how LLMs will sometimes in a situation apologize or retract for putting forward misinformation or hallucinated information. It did make me think one internal mental state that LLMs don't seem to have, which humans do seem to have when it comes to asserting and being mistaken for asserting things, is a sense of shame. So if I say something and then you take that to be an assertion, there'll be a kind of, oh, no, I didn't mean that. Sorry, a sense of shame comes over me. It does make me want to, maybe we should generate a shame-based theory of assertion. A claim is only asserted as being true if the person who is taken to have asserted the claim would feel shame if the audience thought they had asserted P. And maybe that's a thing that AIs or LLMs don't have at this stage. They have no shame. That doesn't mean they won't get it, But at the moment, they've got there's no feeling of shame they have if they make a claim which turns out to be mistaken. But it's more of a comic thought than is a kind of serious thought. Thank you for an excellent and thought-provoking talk. As I'd like to invite the audience to join me in giving Neri either actual real plays or just using the clap hand function that Zoom has. It was an excellent talk and a really good question and answer session afterwards as well. I'm trying not to clap so loud that it blows out the mic.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, true about the shame.
Yes, and that doesn't mean it won't be built in.
Yeah, Butlin and Phoeben maybe come very close to that view actually. So that's maybe not so comical as I thought.
Yeah. Although, as Chris has pointed out in the chat, many human speakers also have no shame, and certainly the best bullshitters we have in the world, our Donald Trumps, our Elon Musks, get by because they lack that shame. But that's we might take to be one of those exceptions that proves the rule thing. That the fact that there are these shameless individuals out there shows you how much a role shame plays in most normal interactions. So, but yes, I say that was more of a comic thought than it was a serious philosophical one. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks again.
I'll just quickly share my screen again, because if people, hold on, I need to, there it is. If people would like to know more about the, oh no, the share has come, having the share issue again as we had before. There we go. If you would like to know more about the seminar series in China, you can join the WeChat group. Otherwise, you can email me at m.dentith@bnu.edu.cn. I'll be advertising the seminar series for next semester on the WeChat group via an email list, and also on places like Phil Events, APhil, and the Phil Owl newsletter. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you very much for turning up, and hopefully I'll see you in a seminar soon.
Is the time usually this one?
Well, so the time usually fits in with the speaker. So because most of the speakers are from outside of China, if they're from the EU, then it's usually around about this time. If they're from the US, it tends to be early morning China time, which is usually middle of the night EU time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. I'll talk with you all hopefully soon. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.